Hi friends, my name is Cindy and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today we are continuing our wonderful read aloud of The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs and illustrated by Edward Gorey. And we had just discovered some papers in an old organ, and this was the last picture of Lewis running away from the moth with all the papers. Are you ready? A little while later, Jonathan, Lewis, and Mrs. Zimmerman were sitting around Mrs. Zimmerman's kitchen table drinking cocoa. The dusty papers lay in a heap on the table. Jonathan put down his mug and said, "No, Lewis, I tell you again, they're nothing to worry about. Old Isaac was crazy as a coot. This stuff has nothing to do with that ticking noise in the walls. Or if it does, it can't help us any. It can only frighten us. I'd say that was why Isaac left those papers there, wouldn't you, Jonathan? To frighten us to death, I mean?" This was Mrs. Zimmerman speaking. She was standing at the stove with her back to Lewis, and she was making a great show of stirring the cocoa. "Sure, I'd say that was it, Florence," said Jonathan, nodding. "One last trick for the road and that sort of thing." Lewis looked from one to the other. He knew they were covering up, but what could he say? One thing would lead to another, and before long he would have to tell about Halloween night. When you are hiding something, you get the feeling that every other secret is connected to your secret. Lewis couldn't challenge anyone for fear of being exposed himself. Late that night, Lewis lay awake in his bed, listening to Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman talking. They were in the study below, and as usual, their voices drifted up the hot air register. And as usual, he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. He got out of bed and crawled over to the wooden grating in the floor. A warm breath of heat softly beat at his face. He listened. Even now, he just couldn't hear well enough. There was only one thing to do. He had to use the secret passageway. Lewis put on his bathrobe and tiptoed down the back stairs. The kitchen was dark. Good. Slowly, carefully, he removed all the china from the shelves of the china cupboard. Then he tripped the hidden spring, and the cupboard swung outward. He walked softly in. This time, Lewis remembered to bring a flashlight. Not that he needed it much. He didn't have far to go, and light shone through many chinks into the cobwebbed passage. Before long, he was standing behind the bookcases that lined the wall of Jonathan's study. He peered through a crack in the boards, and there, beyond the books, were Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman. Mrs. Zimmerman had just conjured up a match out of thin air, and she was lighting a long, twisted cigar with it. She blew smoke out of both corners of her mouth. "Well, now we know," she said. "Yes, now we know." Jonathan's voice came from his leather armchair, where he sat slumped. All that Lewis could see of him was one blue-sleeved arm and a set of hairy knuckles grasping the chair arm. "The question is," Jonathan went on, "can we do anything about it?" Mrs. Zimmerman began to pace. Cigar smoke trailed off behind her. She scraped the large purple stone of her ring along the whole length of a bookshelf. "Do?" she said. "Do? We fight them. What else?" Jonathan gave a hoarse laugh. It made Lewis feel very uncomfortable. "Easier said than done, Florence. They're both stronger than we are, you know. We only fiddle around with magic. They gave their lives to it. As for her, she may have quite literally given her life for it." "But why would they want to do what they're doing?" said Mrs. Zimmerman, folding her arms and puffing angrily at her cigar. "Why? This beautiful world. End it. Why?" Jonathan thought a minute. "Well, Florence, I can't really see into the workings of a mind like Isaac Izard's, but I'd say the answer was scientific curiosity. Think of all that's been written about the last day. Graves opening, bodies rising up fresh and new. Some think there will be a whole new earth, much better than the present one. Wouldn't you like to see it? And another thing occurs to me. Isaac and Selena Izard didn't enjoy this world very much. Why shouldn't they try for the next one?" Jonathan puffed on his hookah. There was silence for several minutes. "And the clock," said Mrs. Zimmerman. "I have to hand it to you. You were dead right. There is a real, literal clock in these walls. He calls it a device, but it has to be a clock. He wasn't kind enough to tell us where it is, of course, though it seems to me that he tells practically everything else. He even gives hints about where he hid the key. Not that that matters now. She broke her cigar in two and threw it into the fireplace. But there's one thing I'd like to know, she said, turning suddenly to Jonathan. Why did he need a clock to bring about the end of the world? Louis gasped and put his hand over his mouth. Then it was going to be the end of the world after all. Because he lost the moment, Jonathan answered, the moment he had been seeking all those years. It was quite a search that old Isaac made. That's why he has all these crazy notes about mackerel skies and last judgment skies and clouds that look like chariots and trumpets and masks of doom. That was what he was after. A mask of doom. A sky that would be right for his incantations. Sky magic is old stuff, as you know. The Romans used to... Yes, cut in Mrs. Zimmerman impatiently. I know all about sky and bird divination. Who's got the D.Mag.A. degree around here anyway? All right, so the right sky comes along for old droopy drawers. Fine, dandy. So why doesn't he just wave his wand and turn us all into mullygrubs? Because by the time he had made sure it was the right kind of sky, the sky had changed. It doesn't take long for clouds to move and change their patterns, you know. Or maybe he lacked the heart to do it. It sounds silly, but I keep hoping that was what held him off. Him? Lack the heart? Isaac Izard? He was a hard man, Jonathan. He'd have pulled out his mother's teeth one by one if he had to have them for some devil magic. Jonathan sighed. Maybe you're right. I don't know. The important thing is that he did miss his opportunity. That's why he had to build the clock, to bring the time back, the exact time when everything was right and in its place. That's what he means when he talks about a device to redeem the time. Redeem, indeed. He wanted to destroy us all. Mrs. Zimmerman was pacing again. All right, she said. All right. So he built the clock. Why didn't he just wind it up? He couldn't, not all the way at any rate. Didn't you read that passage? Jonathan got up and went to the library table where the papers were lying. He picked them up and leafed until he found the page he wanted. Ah, here it is. But when the device was completed, I found that I lacked the skill to wind it all the way up. I have tried, but I must conclude that one with greater power than I possess will be needed for the final adjustment. Curse the day she left me. Curse the day she went away. She might have done it. Jonathan looked up. In that last sentence, the word she is underlined 4 times. She, of course, is our friend across the street. Louis closed his eyes. Mrs. O'Meagher really was Mrs. Izard then. He had guessed it, of course, but he hadn't been sure. Mrs. Izard! And he had let her out. He felt like the stupidest, most foolish person in the whole world. Ah, yes, said Mrs. Zimmerman, smiling wryly. Well, we shall see in the end who is stronger. But tell me one thing more, O sage, since it seems that you have been cast in the role of explicator and annotator of the Testament of Isaac Izard. Yes, what would you like to know, Florence? Well, he claims that the clock isn't wound all the way up, but it has been making a ticking sound for years now, a magical ticking that seems to be coming from behind every wall in this house. It's hard for me to believe that the clock is just whiling the time away until old Auntie Izard arrives with her key. What is the clock doing? Jonathan shrugged. Search me, Florence. Maybe it's trying to drag the house back into the past without the aid of that final adjustment. Maybe he fixed it so the ticking sound would scare away anyone who might be foolish enough to come and live in this house. Isaac didn't want his clock found by accident and destroyed, after all. I don't know why the clock is ticking, Florence, but I do know this. When Mrs. Izard, or whoever is over there, puts that key in the slot of that clock and finishes the job that Isaac started, then, at that moment, Isaac Izard will return. You and I and Louis will be ghosts or something worse, and he will be standing in the turret with power in his right hand, and the end of the world will come to pass. Louis clamped both hands over his mouth. He fell to his knees, shuddering and sobbing. For a moment he was on the verge of shouting, "Here I am, come and get me," so they could come and take him away and put him in the detention home for life. But he didn't shout. He clamped his hands more tightly over his mouth and cried in muffled bursts that shook his whole body. He cried for a long time, and when he was through, he sat staring listlessly at the dark wall of the passageway. Mrs. Zimmerman and Jonathan left the room. The fire burned low, but still Louis sat there. His mouth was full of the taste of ammonia, and his eyes burned. He took his handkerchief out of the pocket of his bathrobe and blew his nose. Where was the flashlight? Ah, here it was. He clicked it on. Louis got up slowly and started to pick his way toward the entrance. Even though he was walking upright, he felt as if he were slinking. Now he was running his hand over the splintery back of the china cupboard. He tripped the spring, and the cupboard swung silently outward. Louis half expected to see Mrs. Zimmerman and Jonathan sitting there with their arms folded, waiting for him. But the kitchen was dark and empty. Louis went up to his room. He felt as if he had stayed awake 3 nights in a row. Without even stopping to take off his bathrobe, he threw himself onto the rumpled bed. Darkness filled his brain, and he fell into a dead and dreamless sleep. Chapter 9, and here is the chapter heading picture. The next day was Saturday, and Louis woke up in a state of panic. He was like a pressure cooker with the lid clamped on tight and the steam hole clogged up with chewing gum. Thoughts kept bubbling and seething to the surface of his mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. What was he going to do? What could he do? Louis sat up and looked around the room. 2 long panes of sunlight lay on the splintered and paint-stained floor. Over by the fireplace stood a tall mirror with battlements on top that matched the ones on Louis's bed. Beside the mirror lay a beautiful hooked rug. Jonathan claimed that Mrs. Zimmerman's great-grandmother had made it. The pattern of the rug was autumn leaves, scallop-edged leaves, bright gold and deep blood red, with some green ones thrown in for contrast. The rug seemed to float before the mirror, and the leaves swam in the pool of bright sunlight. It was an illusion, of course. This was no magic carpet, but Louis did like to stand on it in the morning while he was dressing. It made him feel that he was free of the earth, if only for a little while. He stood on it now as he pulled on his pants and tucked in his shirt. The shimmer of leaves lifted him off the floor. Things seemed clearer now. He had to get hold of Tarby. Tarby would know what to do. It was true that he had been avoiding Louis, but they weren't exactly enemies. And anyway, Tarby was in this thing as deep as he was. He had held the flashlight while Louis drew the magic pentacle and chalked in the name. Selena. That must be Mrs. Izzard's first name, Louis thought. She must have put it in my head. Then, behind those iron doors, she was never really dead. Louis bit his lip to cut off this line of thought. He went downstairs, ate breakfast alone, and hurried out the door. Tarby, with his 9 brothers and sisters, lived in a huge frame house halfway across town. Louis had never been invited there, and he did not even know the first names of Tarby's mother and father, let alone the names of any of the 9 brothers and sisters. He knew that Mr. Corrigan, that was Tarby's last name, ran a hardware store, and that was about all Louis knew. It was a bright, windy April day, and the sky was full of little white clouds that kept tearing apart and merging into each other. Birds were flying about, and the lawns were showing the first livid wet green. When Louis got to the Corrigan house, he found a bunch of small children playing in the front yard, which was all chewed up and full of mud holes. One of the younger ones, who looked a lot like Tarby, was hanging by his knees from one of the limbs of a dead tree that had red taillight reflectors nailed all over it. Other kids were making mud castles, beating each other over the head with sand shovels, trying to ride broken tricycles, or just sitting around screaming at the top of their lungs. Louis picked his way past the toy trucks and inner tubes that littered the front walk. He pushed the doorbell and waited. After a while, a fat, tired-looking woman came to the door. She had a baby in her arms, and it was batting her on the shoulder with a bottle that it held by the nipple. Yes, she sounded crabby, and no wonder. Mrs. Corrigan, I wonder if you could tell me where Tarby is. Tarby? Gee, I wonder if he's in the house. I'll see. She threw back her head and bellowed, "Tarby!" No answer, though it would have been hard to hear one over the racket. "No, I guess not," she said. She smiled a tired, kind smile. "He's probably out playing ball with the other kids." Louis thanked her and was about to turn away when she said, "Say, aren't you that Barnevelt boy?" Louis said that he was. She gave him a pleading look. "Please don't tell Tarby any more stories about ghosts and graveyards. He had nightmares for a week after last Halloween. It was nice of your uncle to invite him over for a cider and donut party and let him stay the night and all, but those stories, well, you know how sensitive he is." Louis managed to keep a straight face. Sure. Okay, Mrs. Corrigan. I won't tell him any more ghost stories. See you." As he picked his way back down the walk, tripping on toys and dodging one or two mud balls that were thrown his way, Louis had a hard time keeping from laughing right out loud. So that was Tarby's version of last Halloween night. Well, well, and where had Tarby spent the night? Shuddering under the back porch? Sleeping in a tree? And a whole week of nightmares. Of course, he hadn't been scared. It was just the moonlight. Louis's inner laughter turned into a wry grin. Louis stopped at a hitching block to tie his shoelace. Now what was he going to do? Well, there were only 2 regular baseball diamonds in New Zebedee, the one right out behind the school and the one at the athletic field. He decided to go to the one at the school. When he got there, he found Tarby playing ball with a lot of other kids. He was pitching, and various boys were shouting, "Come on, Tar, baby, strike him out," and "Give him the old knuckleball," or if they happened to be on the other side, "Yeah, pitcher's got a rubber arm." Tarby wound up with a windmill motion, balked several times. This was allowed because it was softball, not baseball, and when he had the batter making nervous little half swings, he fired the ball up to the plate. The batter swung so hard that he fell down. "Strike 3, you're out," yelled the boy who was the umpire. Louis, standing on the sidelines, cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Hey, Tarby, can I talk to you?" "Not now, Fatty. I'm in the middle of a game." Tears filled Louis's eyes. Tarby had never called him Fatty before. At least he couldn't remember him doing it. Louis choked back the tears and stood waiting patiently while Tarby mowed down the next batter with 3 blazing fastballs. That was the 3rd out, so Tarby's team came in from the field. Carelessly, Tarby threw his glove on the ground and said, "Hiya, Louis, what can I do for you?" "My Uncle Jonathan's in some terrible trouble. We're all in awful trouble. You know that night when we went up to the cemetery?" To Louis's complete surprise, Tarby grabbed him by the collar and yanked him forward till their faces were about 2 inches apart. "Look, if they ever find out that you were up there that night, you tell them that you were up there by yourself. If you don't, you'll have 2 broken arms and maybe a broken head." Louis tried to shake himself free of Tarby's grip, but he couldn't. He felt blood rushing into his face as he shouted, "Tarby, this is worse than Halloween stuff. This is ghosts and witches and devils, and let go of me, you candlehead." Tarby let go of Louis. He stared at him with his mouth open. Candlehead was just a name someone had called someone in a comic book Louis was reading. It didn't mean anything. Tarby's lips drew together. "What did you call me?" Several of the other boys started to shout, "Fight, fight," though they really didn't expect much of one. It was only Louis, after all. Louis stood there, red-faced and frightened. I don't know what I called you." "Well, remember next time." Tarby raised his fist and brought it down hard on Louis's shoulder. It really hurt. "Come on, Tarby," shouted a tall boy named Carl Holabaugh. "Don't waste your time with Tubbo. You lead off this inning, and we're 6 runs behind. Get up there and slug it." Tarby turned back to the game, and Louis stumbled off down the street, rubbing his shoulder. He was crying. With the tears still welling uncontrollably into his eyes, Louis started to walk. He walked all over town, past rows of houses that stared at him blankly. They had no advice to give him. He walked down Main Street and stared for a while at the Civil War monument, but the stone soldiers with their upraised bayonets and cannon swabbers did not have anything to say to him either. He walked to the other end of Main Street and stared at the fountain that spumed a crystal willow tree from within a circle of marble columns. At night, the fountain was lit up, and it turned from red to orange, and from orange to yellow, and from yellow to blue, and from blue to green, and back to red again. But right now it was clear. Louis wished his mind were clear too, but it wasn't. He walked around the fountain 3 or 4 times, and then he crossed the street and started to walk up US 9, which took up where Main Street left off, and led out of town. When he got to the square, tin city limits sign, he just walked off into some tall grass and sat there, watching ants crawl and listening to the cars as they whooshed past. His eyes were dry now. He was through crying. It occurred to him that he had been doing a lot of crying lately. That wasn't going to solve anything. Thinking might help, though he wasn't sure it would. He sat and thought, and tried to make up his mind what to do. It was late in the afternoon when Louis got up. He almost fell over because his left leg had gone to sleep. After he stomped around in the weeds for a while to get the circulation going again, he set out for home. His mind was made up. All he could hear in his head was the old church hymn that ran, "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side." He imagined that he was leading a cavalry charge. If he had had one of Jonathan's canes with him, he would have swung it like a sword. Now and then he stopped and felt goose pimple shivers run in waves through his body. He felt very proud and brave, and very frightened too. It is a hard thing to describe. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, Louis crawled out of bed and tiptoed down the front stairs. The house was quiet, very quiet, because it was one of those nights when Jonathan had stopped all the clocks. All but the one that he couldn't stop. Out in the front hall, the mirror on the coat rack was talking to itself amid little bursts of static. Now and then its edges flickered faintly. Maybe it was trying to warn Louis. If it was, he ignored the warning. His mind was made up. He had started this whole horrible business, and now he was going to try and end it. His hand rested on the cool lip of the willow-ware umbrella stand. He groped among the canes, rattling them a good deal. Ah, here it was. His hand closed on the black wooden rod. And what was this? Louis pulled his fingers away with a sucked-in gasp. Touching the magic cane was like touching a living human arm. Life pulsed through it. Louis stood there, staring at the cane. Its globe was now faintly lit. In the gray light, he saw snow swirling, and there, shadowy but real, was the strange little castle. The magic light cast a pale, shaking blotch on the wallpaper. Could he use it, this thing of power? It occurred to him that Jonathan was being very modest when he called himself a parlor magician. Louis set his teeth and reached out with a hand that still tingled from the shock it had received. He grasped the rod firmly. He drew it out. The globe sizzled and crackled and turned from gray to rosy pink and then back to gray again. Now he opened the front door. A wet, fresh-smelling breeze blew in and banged the door gently against the wall. The leaves of the chestnut tree drifted and sighed, and white blossoms came sailing down. He looked across the street. Despite the overgrown hedge, he could see that there were lights on in the Hanchett house. Muttering a prayer, he started down the steps. On the middle of the street, he almost turned and ran, but something kept him going. Once he had crossed to the other side, it seemed easier to go on. It was like running downhill with the wind pushing you. The hedge parted at the brick wall that led up to the front stoop. Louis walked in under the overhanging branches. Now he was at the bottom of the steps. The Hanchett house had an old-fashioned double door of black wood with 2 frosted panes set in it. The panes always reminded Louis of the 10 Commandments, and now he thought, "Thou shalt not enter." But one door panel stood ajar. Was he expected? His heart was pounding, but he went up. He stopped just inside the door, under the hall lamp. The corridor was empty and bare. There wasn't a stick of furniture in it. No chairs or chests or little tables. No umbrellas propped against walls. On the pale rose-colored wallpaper, Louis saw dark squares. The squares were the color the paper had been when it was new. The Hanchetts had hung pictures in these spaces, but now the pictures were gone. Mrs. O'Meagher had not put up any of her own. And we're going to find out what happens with Lewis the next time when we conclude the book. This is The House with a Clock in Its Walls. I am Cindy, one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I hope you'll come back for the exciting conclusion of The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs and illustrated by Edward Gorey. Thanks for coming by, friends. Bye-bye.